So hello and welcome back. In today's video, we are going to be learning and practicing some acrylic painting techniques today. If you are in my studio art class, we have already learned how to mix color in isolation. We started here with our color wheel, and you know I'm only giving you our primaries, blue, yellow, and red, and you're mixing everything else with your palette knife on your palette paper. We're mixing each color in isolation and painting them in. We did the same thing over here with our tints and shades, except now we've added white and black. And then down here we practice our complementary pairs. As you know, complements are colors that are across from each other on the color wheel. We mix those together and we realize that when we do, the intensity of the color sort of comes down a little bit, right? Now that we know how to mix color, now I want to show you some techniques of how to use your brush and your knife to create different effects that you might see in your reference or in your painting inspiration. What you're going to need today is you're going to need some blank white paper. Today we're going to be using drawing paper. This is 9 by 12 drawing paper. I have this for you in the classroom. You can also use some printer paper. We're just practicing, so any paper will do. You're also going to need your palette paper, your knife, your brush, something to write with, water, and paper towel. And then you're going to need 2 different colors. You can choose any colors you want. I'm going to use red and yellow like I did in my example here, but up to you. Take some, not a lot. You can always take more. You can't put it back. For our techniques that we're going to practice, the first one's going to be wet on wet, which we're going to start to call blending. And the second one is wet on dry, or cutting in. So in a minute, I'm going to fold my paper and write this in, just not yet. These techniques are the same as when we did the watercolor unit. So if you did that with me, you should know, and this should all be very familiar. But then we're going to move into dry brushing to create some textures, and just mark making in general to create some additional texture. And last but not least, we're going to talk about how you can actually paint with the palette knife itself. And then everyone's favorite is masking. So you're going to need a piece of masking tape a little bit later. We're going to tape it to our paper, paint over it, and pull it off. It's really satisfying. It's a fun little technique that I think is worth knowing. So we're going to be focusing on that in just a bit. I'm going to put these off to the side. I'm going to grab over some paper. Now would be a good time to pause the video if you're working with me, and set yourself up if you're not yet set up. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started. To begin, we're going to take our piece of paper and we're going to fold it in half. I think we call this hamburger style. And I'm going to open that up. We're going to do one piece of paper at a time. And I want you to label the first one wet on wet, which I'm going to start to call blending. While you have your writing instrument in your hand, I'm using a Sharpie so it shows up on camera. You can use a pencil. Number 2, I'm going to call wet on dry. And I'm going to start to call this cutting in. All right, so to get started, we are going to start up top and work our way down. And for wet on wet, for blending, you're going to use both colors on your brush at the same time. When we did our color wheel or our tints and shades, things like that, you were mixing a separate color and then applying one color at a time. Now a little different. This is kind of one of our favorite techniques, is creating a blend between certain colors. So we're going to use these two. When I start to mix these, you're going to see orange come about. But I'm going to grab some red on my brush, both sides, and I'm going to grab some yellow at the same time, both sides. I'm going to turn my paper this way, maybe this way, I don't know. And I'm going to use my brush back and forth with both colors. And I'm going to try and get, with wet paint and wet paint, a blend between 2 colors. So I don't want to mix up a whole color. I want to see that blending right on the surface that you're working on. You can tell that red is super powerful, but if I allow this yellow to sort of exist on its own on top, you'll see that blend happen. right? And I can streak some of this red through it. That's cool. Nice. When I go to grade you on this assignment, I'm looking for you to show me that you understand the technique and that you can do the technique. So for wet on wet, I'm using wet paint and wet paint at the same time to create some kind of blend. You can go back and forth like this. You could also, let me grab another piece of paper. You could also do something like this. If I grab both, you could do little sort of X's, right? You can go back and forth and then like change the direction it's going in. As long as you're getting like a variety of color and allowing it to mix, that's what I'm looking for. It's kind of fiery, isn't it? Okay, so that is painting technique number 1, and it's done. Wet on wet. Guess what? We're gonna wash that brush. Remember, you're putting this straight down in the cup and wiggling this around, working all that paint out. When we used wet on wet for watercolor, we did something similar, but we used, maybe we wet the paper first. You're making sure that you use both colors while they are wet. All right, dry off that brush when you're done. And for number 2 down here, we have wet on dry, which I'm gonna call cutting in. And in order for this to be wet on dry paint, this is wet paint on top of dry paint, we need to apply a color here, allow it to dry, and then we're gonna add some marks on top in a different color. Take a look at your colors that you chose. I'm using yellow and red, and in order for the yellow to stand out against the red, I need to be careful about which one I put down first. I'm gonna put the yellow down completely, and then I'm gonna use red on top. If you chose a different color, I'm gonna turn this around so I can get the clean yellow. If you chose a different color, maybe you have yellow and blue, maybe you have blue and red, put the lighter color down. Got a little bit of red in there, that's okay. Put the lighter color down. That way when you go on top with your darker color, it will stand out. So go ahead and paint a really big swatch of color on this entire thing. If you get some other color in there, that's fine, it's okay. But I'm trying to, keep it solid with one color. Oh, my brush is a little dirty, that's what's going on. It's okay, we're just practicing. And I'm gonna set this aside to dry. So we're gonna return back to this, but we're gonna do that in several minutes once this is completely dry, because we don't want the mixing that's happening there because I didn't wash my brush. I got too excited. I apologize. All right, so I'm gonna make some space next to me. Really wash my brush well this time before I move on. Okay, and again, I'm gonna put this one off to the side. I'm gonna grab another piece of our drawing paper here, folding this one in half again. And I'm gonna grab my marker. And for this one, we're gonna call this one number 3. And this is dry brushing, which is a way to create some texture. And number 4 is gonna be mark making. Which again is another type of texture, another way to create texture. All right, for dry brushing, you're gonna need a piece of paper towel, and you're gonna wanna make sure that your brush to begin is nice and dry. And we're going to try and use the least amount of paint that's possible. And we're just gonna create some texture over here with like barely anything on our brush. So I'm gonna load up my brush a little bit, not too much, like just a little, and I'm gonna sort of swish it off on my palette. And I can even swish it off on my paper towel like that. And then I can use just a little bit of the pigment on my brush to create some texture. I want you to try this. You can be super dry like I have here. Maybe you want to try another color. Let me just dip into my yellow there. It's okay if it mixes. Sort of swish that off, dry it off a little bit, and maybe try a different kind of texture, right? Try a different way to move your brush. Like that. That's kind of cool. And I'm gonna do that again. Try some different sort of textures. Playing around. Maybe you want to do like sort of some curlicues. I don't know. I just want to see that you are applying paint to your brush. You're able to dry it off. And you're able to create some texture with a fairly dry brush situation. This is going to be very different from how we work down here for mark making. All right, so take a moment to do that. When you're done, go ahead and wash that brush. And dry that off. If I'm going too fast for you, remember you can always pause and rewind. Don't let me keep going while you're still working on the last one. But I am going to go ahead and move into mark making, which is another form of texture. Now I've given you just one type of brush. This is a flat, oh no, it's a bright brush, number 14, but it's relatively square or rectangular. Here are a few other brushes. This one is a round. Let's look at this guy. Different size, but this one's a round brush. So they do have many different types of brushes, and I'm going to introduce them as we get going into our choice work. Some smaller brushes, I have some fan brushes, some bigger ones, all different types. But what I want you to focus on for mark making is I want you to use this bright rectangular brush in as many ways as possible. Oftentimes as an artist, you get really sort of enamored by the art supply stores and you think you need every single brush out there, but you really don't. You can really do quite a bit with just one or two tools sometimes, and or it's a good exercise in creativity. So I'm going to grab some of this red, and I want to see you create as many different types of marks in this space as possible. The mark that we're most familiar with is going to be this one, right, where we drag this back towards ourselves and we have that nice brush mark. That is very similar to what I'm going to do next, but if I shorten that stroke to just that, that is a variation of this brush, right, or even that. So like right there, by doing the same motion with my hand, I'm making 3 different types of marks. And if I repeat those marks, I get lots of different textures. I can also overlap. I'm going to add some color here, some yellow. I can also overlap my brush strokes, right, to create a different type of texture in my painting. I can use my brush on the side, and depending on how I push and pull my brush, I can get different effects. So if I push this, right, and then let up, I can get something going on. If I, let me get less paint. If I do this and sort of start and then push and then pull, right? So see what you can do, be creative. You can copy my movements, or you can do something a little different. See how when you move your wrist, things work a little bit differently. Right? What if I do like that? Play around, have some fun, and fill up that whole section, please, with as many different marks. Right? See what happens when you overlap them. And if you like it, fill that up. If you take a look at this one here, what I did last time for my other period class. You can see I tried some of the same marks, I tried some different ones. Up to you. All right. When you're done, guess what? Wash that brush. All right, so this one is done, and I want to just pull this over and check this out, feel it. It's getting pretty dry, but it's still, mine's a little bit cold. It's got a little bit more in there, more water in there, so I'm gonna let it keep drying. I'm gonna put this one off to the side, and then I'm gonna grab another piece of paper, our last one, fold this in half, and we're gonna label it. Oh, there's something that I should have asked you to do right from the start, and I regret it. We never wrote our name. Yikes. So do me a favor, write your name and the period. And if you have to write it in the corner, that's fine. But get your name on this, please, because everyone's are going to look similar. You want to make sure that you have your own. All right, so for our last piece of paper, we're going to label this number 5 and number 6. Number 5 is going to be our use of the palette knife. We're going to call this palette knife application. I also want to mention this word here to you, impasto. And number 6, everyone's favorite, is masking. All right, we are going to do this one first, masking first, because it takes less paint, and then we're going to use up all of our paint that we have left up here, but we do need to return to that wet on dry. All right, you will need for this step for masking, you will need some masking tape. To mask something, like if you put a mask over your face, you're hiding part of it. And for masking tape, this tape is designed for this technique. You might have been using blue painter's tape, perhaps, when you paint your house. Same sort of thing. What we're going to do is we're going to put the tape down, we're going to paint over it and lift that up. I'm going to go close my blind because I'm getting some sun coming in. There we go. All right, so for this masking tape, I should have this in my classroom. Come ask me for it at this point. Go ahead and pause. But when you get this tape, I want you to take the tape and I want you to, I'm gonna pull my sleeve down. I want you to stick it to your clothes and pull it up. And do that a few times. Jeans work really well for this. Get some fuzzies on that. I'm gonna do that one to my shirt, and then I'm gonna do one to my jeans off camera. Maybe your sweatpants, that's a good thing to use. And here you can see some of those fuzzies on there. You want to sort of not have this tape be too sticky. Usually it's okay, but any fuzzies on there is really going to help with the stickiness, because you do want to pull this off and not rip the paper. So I ripped my tape in half. I'm going to do 2 of these this time. This one has more fuzzies. And I want to apply this. The more fuzzies, the less sticky, so you do have to, like, you know, help it out, push that down. But what we're going to do here is we're going to take some of this paint, whatever you want, whatever you got left, you're going to grab some of this paint, and I just want you to paint over it. Okay, whatever you want, I want you to paint over this, because I want you to try peeling this up. This is very low stakes, meaning that you're just going to peel this up right here. It's just like 2 rectangles. But what's cool about this technique is that you can make designs with this tape and really have some fun. And we'll talk more about that in the future. A lot of people use this technique with watercolor also to create a nice border. We didn't really talk about that, but it is an option for you. Now that you have this painted over, however much you want to do, you're going to go ahead and use your fingernail or your palette knife to get the corner and pull that up. And you should have a fairly nice and sharp edged blank space. Now our blank space is white because our paper is white and dry underneath, but I could paint my whole picture one color and then use this to create like a hard edge for a building or something like that, depending on what I am painting or what my subject is. Really cool technique called masking. All right, last but not least, we have our palette knife, but I think we should go back to number 2. Yeah, let's do that first. So I'm gonna put this one to the side. I am gonna come back to it. Let's go ahead and work on our wet on dry. So if you feel this, if yours is not dry, don't do this. Mine's nice and dry though. So I'm going to practice some, let me pull this back over, practice some mark making on top of my dry paint with the other color. So in this case, I'm going to be using red paint on top of the yellow. And this technique is called wet on dry because I'm using wet paint on top of dry paint. So when I do that, I am just getting a solid, I got a little too much paint on my brush, a solid color on top of another color. It is not doing this. It is not blending because it's dry paint that I'm painting wet paint on top of, right? I think I said that a little crazy. If the yellow were still wet, we would get this effect. So I really want you to be mindful that you allow that yellow paint to dry before you attempt cutting in on top. Now this is pretty easy with acrylic paint because acrylic paint dries really quickly. Other types of paint like oil paint, they don't really dry this quick. So this technique of wet on dry is a little harder to achieve. Right, whatever you want to paint, just fill that up in any which way. So that is wet on dry. This only works if my other paint, my yellow paint, is dry. All right, I'm gonna wash my brush because I'm done with the brush for this lesson. So I'm gonna completely wash it and dry it. And we're gonna get ready to move back over to number 5. I know we're jumping around a little bit, but thank you for paying close attention. Remember to pause if you need to. And for number 5, instead of our brush this time, we're gonna go back to our palette knife and we're gonna apply the paint with our palette knife. Now, a lot of artists actually use this as their primary source of painting or tool, and they don't use a brush at all, which is really cool. What's cool about this also is that you can get a little bit thicker of an application of paint, and in Italian, that is referred to as impasto. So I'm gonna grab some, I'm gonna try and get a variety on my knife, and I'm gonna use this to apply, I'm running out of yellow, I can apply my paint with just the knife itself. So I can get some really interesting textures, right? I can sort of skip across the surface. You'll see Bob Ross do this sometimes. All right, I'm gonna grab all that yellow. I can, like, oh, my finger slipped off. I can do that. A little bit of this, a little bit of that. I can use the edge of my knife to create some sharp movements. There's so many possibilities to the textures that I can create with this knife that I can't do with a brush. Look at that, even just like pulling that back up. Allow your paint to be a little bit thicker here. Don't smush it all out, but you can, right? Try a couple of different things. When I go to grade you, I'm looking for you to use your knife, and it's really easy to tell between the two because the textures are different. All right. And with that, we are done with our different techniques. So if I move this out of the way, if you're in my class and you need to submit, I'm gonna ask you to put all 3 in one picture. This one and this guy. So go ahead and grab your iPad if that's what you're going to submit with me, and take a picture of all three together, one frame. Hold your iPad up really high, and then submit that for me so I can check out what you did and how you did it. All right, so there are our techniques. We have wet on wet, wet on dry, two types of texture making, dry brush and mark making, and then we experimented with the palette knife application and masking. We're going to use all of these techniques in our paintings coming up. I hope you enjoyed experimenting with them today, and I'm excited to paint with you in the future.